Hello, everyone, and welcome to the meeting of the E-Club of District 7710 for Tuesday, February 13th, and thank you for joining us. Before we introduce this evening's speaker, we want to remind you about the ways you can connect with the Rotary Club. Our website is Lead With Us, that's leadwith.us, and you can visit, if you visit the page, you'll be able to learn more about the club and reach out to us if you have any questions. We're also on Facebook if you search for Rotary E-Club of District 7710, and you'll also find us on Twitter with @LeadWithUs, excuse me, @LeadWithUs, and Instagram @LeadWithRotary. So please friend or follow us. We're kind of everywhere, so check us out. So now it's my pleasure to pass the torch over to Diana Phillips, who's a member of our club, to introduce tonight's guest speaker.
Hello, I met Johanna on our trip to Nicaragua when we went down to work on a school in the municipality of San Ramon. Johanna's talent for languages came in handy on that trip because she was able to do quite a bit of translating for us. Johanna is a psychologist who has experience in war or conflict trauma situations, and she is a second-year Peace Fellow who made a presentation at the Atlanta Convention last June. And we look forward to hearing about her experience in her presentation tonight and perhaps ideas about what she's going to do following graduation. Johanna, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you. So welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to meet your club and to tell you a little more about what I do and who I am, to get to know you as well. So in this picture, you can already see an impression from the field trip that we did to Nicaragua. And I want to talk a little bit about resilience in the field tonight, because I feel that especially the Rotary clubs here in North Carolina are particularly active in going on these field trips. There's a lot of travel going on, I heard, from many clubs. And the interesting thing is we, in my scholarship program, we talk a lot about field trips and project management in developing countries. But we actually never really talk about the psychological side of it, how to deal with the stress and how to be a resilient helper. So I feel this might be actually very helpful knowledge, and it was great fun to present this at the conference. So I'm happy to repeat that for you as well. In the picture, you can see Randy, a very resilient field-tested Rotarian who is doing everything right. He's taken a break, which is very important. He's protecting himself from the intense sun, as you can see, with his Rotary cap and glasses. He's wearing gloves, safety first. So he's an excellent example to start with. Before I go into stress and field work a bit further, just let me add a little bit to what Diana was telling about me. Let me see how, here we go. So who is Hannah? Who am I? So I'm from Landshut in Bavaria. I'm from a small town, very beautiful, and I have a big family, and I have the great pleasure that here in North Carolina through Rotary, I actually met my future husband as well. So there's a lot going on at the moment as well. I'm a psychologist. I studied at Munich University and was also abroad for a year. So I got really interested in different cultures, different languages, and intercultural communication, because I was very fascinated about all the diversity going on and all the misunderstandings that can arise from intercultural contexts. So that's very fascinating. And Rotary played a crucial part in that, but about that a bit later. So at some point, I got very interested in the work that psychologists do at international organizations. And I found out that actually the area where psychologists are most needed in the international field is psychotrauma, prevention and therapy. So after my graduation in 2009, there I went with a scholarship from the German government to work on a project that I chose myself on PTSD and stress prevention for humanitarian aid workers in the field. So I worked for 1 year, funded by the German government. I worked for the Lebanese Red Cross in Beirut, in Lebanon, for a couple of months. Then I went to New York and worked with journalists about trauma prevention for journalists in conflict zones. Went to the UN Refugee Agency in Geneva to do basically the same, and in the end ended up with the German military. So I got a lot of insights in how different organizations handle stress and PTSD prevention and treatment for their staff members, which is not often ideal, but it's a big issue at the moment and getting a lot better. Social medicine was something that I got interested in after this exciting year. I worked for the children's clinic in Landshut in my hometown, which sounds like a bit of a jump from psychotrauma to child psychology. But actually I did a psychotherapy degree because during my year abroad, I found out that most helpers actually have a lot of stress already. So prevention is important, but psychotherapy is sometimes much more needed. So I worked at a children's clinic as a psychologist to fund my degree, which lasts 5 years in Germany, so it's quite big. Rotary plays a very important role. Actually, Rotary already funded my scholarship when I went to Wales to study psychology for a year there with a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship. And I'm very privileged that now I get funding from Rotary again, many, many years later. And I'm here with the Rotary Peace Fellowship that Diana told you about, which gives up to 50 international fellowships per year. And the fellows study for a Masters of Peace and Conflict Resolution or any other peace-related subject at one of 5 designated institutions, which are here in North Carolina, Duke UNC, in Tokyo, in Japan, in Brisbane, in Australia, Uppsala in Sweden, and Bradford in England. So this is a very diverse program, super interesting people. And I can only encourage you to invite more Peace Fellows to talk to you, because everybody is super different, has a very, very different focus, and has interesting things to say. So yes, and the last final puzzle piece is global public health, which is what I'm doing here, because I wanted to learn more about how can I change and improve an entire health system. Because psychotherapy for individuals is important, but sometimes if you have access to health systems and can change how everything works, you can actually reach many more people to help them. And especially in developing countries, that is the case. Okay, so much about me for now. Back to resilience in the field. In order to understand resilience, we have to understand what is stress. Then I'm going to talk about what causes stress, particularly on Rotary field trips. What are the sources of stress there? What is resilience, and what can we do to protect ourselves when we go abroad, but also actually in everyday life. So it's pretty general, the tips that we have. So what is stress really? Everybody talks about it, but what is it really? What does it do with our body and our mind? And by the way, if you have questions, just let me know, okay? Meanwhile, if I'm going too fast or if it's a bit complicated terminology, I hope not, but if just let me know. So actually, if we define stress, stress is actually, first of all, a neutral reaction to any sort of change or challenge that requires us to do something in response. Getting out of bed is a very mild form of stress, for some more, for some less, but it's actually something that requires us to do something in response. So we have to get up and get ready for the day. And stress actually is a continuum. So of course, you have very mild stress, for example, driving or a family gathering. Again, this could be more stressful for some people. You have more intense stress, which could be a pretty tough day at work or moving house. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have traumatic stress, trauma. So for example, a severe accident, or we witness an attack or something like that. Our body is actually pretty well built to deal with stress, but with different stress from today. So our body, the way our body and mind works is actually like around about 10,000 years old. So what were the stress factors 10,000 years ago? Of course, you had to gather food, but you also had to defend yourself against sudden threats like tiger jumping out of the bushes, for example. So if that happens, I'm under attack, right? My very first impulse is to freeze. This can be like a fraction of a second. It can last longer, but it's an orientation reaction where our body and mind try to find out what's going on. It's very important also to recall appropriate action, because if I know what's going on, I might have a solution. So this is the first thing we do. And then the next best reaction after I've oriented myself is to run away. That's actually always the safest option, to run away. But that highly depends on the location or the time that I have to run away, right? If I'm in a corner and I can't run, I have a problem. But generally, running is always the better option. Fighting is an option if I cannot run away. So if it makes sense and if it improves the chances for survival, that's what I do. If fighting also doesn't help, our body actually surrenders. So that is actually a playing dead reflex when people kind of pass out. And if I've survived so far, luckily, then I come back to consciousness and I recover and my senses come back to normal. So this is what we're built for, right? This is what's going on in our body when we have stress. We prepare for running away, fighting, or giving up, depending how severe the stress is. What's happening in the brain is pretty interesting, actually, and explains a lot about why we react the way we do. So we have a sudden, we first have to know, of course, like the different areas. I just do it very briefly. There is a panic button in our brain. It's called the amygdala, and that is responsible for the shock reaction that we have when somebody startles you, or you watch a horror movie and it's always like this loud noise and suddenly the monster comes up, or something like that. So these shock effects, they only work with the amygdala, this tiny region in our brain that scares us so much. And the amygdala is very close to the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, which is why extremely stressful memories don't go away, which actually kind of makes sense for survival. If you think that if you are in a dangerous situation again, you should remember how you got away the first time and how to save yourself. So it actually makes you more resilient, makes you safer to remember well what was a problem. Unfortunately, if we experience chronic trauma, repeated trauma, this area shrinks, and that has a lot of like mental health consequences. And the whole system is called the limbic system, which is important for our emotional reactions and also for happiness, but especially in the trauma reaction, it's very, very important. So what happens? I have a sudden movement, or I hear a loud bang, screaming, and that reaches my attention. So actually this immediately triggers the amygdala, our panic button, and that causes a state of stress in our brain, which actually has a number of consequences. So in this state of mind, we have the instinct basically takes over, takes all of the control. We cannot react consciously most of the time. So we have this orientation reaction, and then we get a tunnel vision. We cannot see what's left or right because that prepares us for running away. We can see straight really clearly, really well, but left or right is not as important when I'm trying to escape, right? We get more blood to the muscles, which is good for the fight or flight reaction because I can run really fast or I can fight. And my senses are heightened, and my memory of vision, hearing, and smelling is super, super strong. So, for example, in the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York, I met a survivor, and he said he was buried under a mass of steel, and 3 or 4 firefighters tried to lift it up, and they couldn't. But actually he moved it in order to pull his leg out. And it was this survival instinct that gave him so much power and strength that he actually managed to free himself. And it was like a miracle that he grew extra muscles, if you may. And this is something the body does, that it like pulls together all the strengths that it has for in order to save our survival. Exactly. So the problem is that our stressors today, usually the ones that we have in everyday life or on trips, they are actually not what we're built for. So I cannot run away from my work. I cannot run away from my computer, from emails. Well, I can, but it's not helping any at all. So it's not the way to tackle my stress. But actually our body wants to do that. So our body, when we're stressed, does all these things to fight or flight, but we actually don't do it. We sit around and we sit in front of the computer. So this is why we react so much with stress, and why we develop so many problems like headaches and psychosomatic problems, eating problems, all sorts of things that actually are stress reactions, because we cannot do what we actually should do. So common stress reactions nowadays are actually emotional, that I feel helpless, I lose my pleasure when I have too much stress repeatedly, chronically. I cannot really enjoy what I'm doing. Biologically, people are fatigued, cannot sleep, are super nervous all the time, cannot relax and calm down, gastrointestinal problems, decreased appetite, lots of things. A lot of people withdraw from social life, have stress with relationships. Substance abuse is a huge problem because people try to calm themselves down, and it's of course an easy solution, which is of course in the long run not helpful, but it's something that seems helpful in the short term. Employment dropout would be an extreme example. Also, concentration is suffering, confusion occurs, intrusive thoughts, self-blame, a lot of like very unpleasant side effects, and all because our stress system is not built for the stresses of today. Culture plays a very important role, because different people from different cultures actually cope differently with stress, but that's a whole topic for another presentation. So what does it do when a volunteer, for example, is completely burned out and stressed out? How do you recognize that in a colleague, for example? So of course there could be clinical symptoms like a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the result of an extreme stress situation, existential. Disengagement, people are not as committed anymore as they used to be. They're very irritable. You just ask them for a pen and they're all over you. And burnout, fatigue, that becomes apparent. Avoidance, people don't show up for work, absenteeism is a common phenomenon, and even hostility towards beneficiaries, which is a problem because the beneficiaries in a development project, for example, are why I'm here for, right? So all these symptoms are actually not the point of Rotary field projects. So of course, we want to avoid stress as much as possible, as it doesn't help. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so thankfully Rotary field projects are not that stressful, right? Ideally, but what causes stress there? So typical stresses on Rotary field trips, and you can add to it or correct me if you have different experiences. Culture shock can actually play a role. I end up in a different culture that I haven't been. I don't really know why people act the way they do, so that can actually be quite confusing. The working conditions are not always easy, right? You work in an unsecured area, or it's very hot. The climatic conditions are very difficult. The tools are maybe rudimentary, so the working conditions might be not as ideal as you might be used to. Of course, there's always social interpersonal factors. If people get along or don't get along, that is just human and happens everywhere. Health can play an important role if, for example, you're not adapting well to the climate, or you're eating something that your body cannot process as well as it should. So health might actually add stress to the whole experience. And then here we go. Compassion distress is something that a lot of people underestimate, especially when you haven't been exposed to extreme poverty and all of a sudden you find yourself in a field project, for example, in India or Central America, and you're confronted with extreme poverty and people who are suffering and have a really terrible situation where there's not much help available. That can actually be very stressful, that volunteers who do that out of the goodness of their heart, that they feel overwhelmed because they, of course, they want to help more and help better, but their hands are tied or their means are limited and the time is limited. So that can cause a lot of emotional stress. Unexpected problems and project management, for example, the material is not there, the people don't show up. These things are actually very common and can have to be dealt with a lot of humor. And here we are with the solutions. So what can you do? I will actually send Eva a handout with some tips for Rotary field projects, but also tips for like personal relaxation and stress management. And I hope it's going to be helpful for you not only on trips but also in everyday life. So how to deal with unexpected problems. Ideally, relax. This is what projects are about and how they work, and never lose your good humor. That is very important. The more time I plan, the less ambitious I plan my schedule, the easier it is to deal with unexpected things, right? So it's very important to tell yourself, even if you cannot complete the schedule completely, you still did a good job and you still helped a lot. So that's important, not to stress out over that. Culture shock can be very helpful to have cultural mediators on board, for example, Peace Fellows, who speak the language and who can also explain the culture a little bit to mediate between both sides a little bit. In terms of health, of course, there's a lot of precautions that you can take with either your doctor, finding out, am I really like suited for that climate, or maybe not. And the compassion distress is a very important issue where you have to be aware that the conditions are not your responsibility. Extreme poverty is always a result of war, of course, but also of less than ideal governance. So it needs a very high administrational level in order to alleviate poverty for good. So a week of a project is not gonna change much, but a little bit. So that's very important, and it's important to tell yourself that you're doing whatever you can, but there are limits, and being there and showing goodwill is already a very important step, right? So these are just some examples. Any questions so far, or maybe experiences that you want to share or add to from your experience?
Hi, Johanna. This is great. I wanted to share, for instance, the culture shock. I found that when preparing to go overseas, having some type of opportunity to talk to the people that may live there or have lived there before in preparation, learning maybe a few greeting in the language, eating some of the food, you know, listening to the cultural things like the music and things like that, just to prepare. I mean, ultimately, especially when you're going into impoverished places, you don't know how you're going to react. Even if you read it, you see it, you're told, until you're physically there, there's so many things, like you're saying, that are happening at once. You don't know how your response will be. But I would think that preparation prior, you know, would actually diminish some of this for you.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. That reminded me of an example a professor told me who took a student to, I think, Botswana, and as it turns out, they came out of the airplane, and he had actually never seen many African people at once. He came from a very white community, and he was so culture shocked that he stayed at the airport and took the next plane home, which of course it's for people who travel a lot, it's kind of sounds kind of silly, but this man was just shocked, and he never went abroad again. And the professor himself, in the end, that he said, I didn't prepare him properly. I didn't go over with him over pictures and music and to explain the culture to him before we left. So preparation is super important.
Yeah. In corporate America, we have to take classes before we go. And we had an instance like that. And this isn't even impoverished at all. This was just going to Asia country, and they, you know, I think it was like Japan or something, and we were told how we're supposed to accept things by bowing, not bowing, but lowering yourself slightly. And the person had a problem with that, and it was like, wow, you know, and they did not participate. I don't know what happened, you know, but after that, but they just didn't come back to the training. So
yeah, there was in Germany, there was an incident. I don't know if you know about that. On Carnival, there's a specific day, which was last Thursday, and we called it Old Women's Carnival. And the women are allowed to cut men's ties on that day, only on that day. And it's actually a tradition. So some women go out with their scissors and hunt men's ties, and men usually know that, so they wear either paper ties or really old ones that they wanted to get rid of anyways. So that actually works pretty well within the culture. But a Japanese businessman got off the plane that day a couple of years back and got out of the airport, and the first thing that happened was that 3 women kissed him and cut off his tie. He was so shocked that he actually also took the next flight back home, and the business meeting was canceled, and he didn't want to have any business to do with Germany ever again. So that was pretty dramatic for the business who wanted to close a contract with him. But yeah, this is how things go. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you so much. Anybody else who wants to share an experience or has a question so far? Okay. So resilience, what is it in the first place? It's actually pretty hard to define. It's easier actually to look at people who are resilient, meaning who don't get sick from stress and who don't develop a post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, after a traumatic event, which is basically 90% of all people, by the way. So only 10% of people who experience a traumatic event actually get sick with post-traumatic stress disorder. So rather than asking us what makes people sick, it's very, very helpful to actually see what makes people stay healthy, what protects them from getting sick. So resilient people, what do? They are inherently optimistic. So even in the worst situations, when everything goes wrong, nobody shows up and nothing works out, they still see the silver lining. And this is actually something, of course, some people have it like genetically or from their family upbringing, but this is actually something I can train. That I say, okay, I have this one voice in the one ear and the other voice in the other ear. The one is pessimistic, the other one is optimistic. That I try to listen more to the optimistic voice, and always when I'm thinking something bad, like this is never going to work, I try to contradict myself and say, no, there might be a solution. Let's think harder, right? Spread positivity. So if you are actually a person who makes other people happier or cheers people up, that actually makes you yourself happier and makes you yourself less susceptible to mental health issues and also to stress. So that is a protective factor. Resilient people can utilize their good sense of humor. That's what I said earlier, like even when everything goes wrong, never lose your sense of humor, because this is what keeps you going, right? So this helps. Have a good laugh with friends, with colleagues who are on the same trip. Stay calm under pressure is easier said than done, but is actually very helpful, which can be more easily achieved if, for example, the more stressed I feel, the more I force myself to take a deep breath. And if you take a deep breath, actually you can feel it physically from head to toe, that it does something good to you. And the longer you practice deep breathing, the calmer you will get. So resilient people are very capable of calming themselves down or staying calm in the first place, which is very fortunate. Resilient people also don't feel easily overwhelmed, which is also lucky, but also a matter of how I deal with my cognitions. It also has a lot to do with optimism, that whenever I start feeling overwhelmed, that I either do something about it, that I get more organized, or I go out for a run, or I tell myself it's gonna be okay. I'm gonna be able to handle it. I've had worse, or I ask for help, right? Which is also something resilient people do. If I only have one coping mechanism, getting a glass of wine or only going for a run, and I don't know anything else what I can do about my stress, that's not enough. So you need a toolkit with self-relaxation techniques, but also social skills, that you talk to friends, that you talk to colleagues, that you exercise, that you enjoy your food very, very consciously and very much, that you watch a movie that really calms you down, read a book, or whatever is best suited for you yourself to help yourself out of a stressful situation. Resilient people take action to address their challenges, because if I feel helpless and passive, I will feel stressed and overwhelmed, and it will not help me at all. But if I stay active and do something, that is actually super helpful and protective. researchers in Britain, they found out that if after a mass casualty event, like a large-scale accident on the road, if you give people a Game Boy, if you remember, with Tetris, and they play Tetris after the traumatic event, which sounds ridiculous. They will ask, like, why should I do this? But they actually did that with a lot of patients, and actually playing Tetris helped people not develop a post-traumatic stress disorder. Why? Because it simulates to the brain that you're being active, that you have control over something you do in a control-free environment of an accident. So control is something super important. And if I have a feeling of control, that actually protects my mental health in those situations. Control the emotional expression. You might know, like, for example, when you talk about how dreadful you feel, you actually feel even more dreadful, or it gets cemented. This feeling doesn't get any better. If you try to look on the bright side and talk about something else and talk about, oh, well, it's gonna be okay, you actually will feel better. There's also another psychological mechanism that's pretty funny. When you smile, even if you don't feel like smiling, actually the muscles that make you smile, they tell your brain that you're happy. So your brain actually releases more happiness hormones, more endorphins, which is kind of weird. So if you feel really, really dreadful and you force yourself to smile, that will actually physically make you happier in that moment. It's not a huge effect. It will not save your life, but in situations when you feel stressed out, actually cracking a smile can be more helpful than you'd think. And the other way around, if you indulge in unpleasant emotions, it will pull you down. Seek support, super important. People who never ask for help are more helpless, are more lonely, of course. And there's always an open ear or somebody who can give you a hand and help you. And that is especially true in challenging environments, like in projects in developing countries where you feel culture shocked or you're sick, or so you're never alone. And that is something very important. So this is actually the recipe to being stress resilient, as it seems. Do you have any questions or examples, experiences about that?
Well, I did want to ask, you mentioned playing a game called Tetris. What is that?
It's a very old game, I think from 80s, 70s, where building blocks that are either totally straight or a square, or they do a little corner, they float down from the top, and you have very few seconds to turn them around so that they fit into each other. And if you manage that they land in a straight line, in a horizontal line, then the line will disappear. But if you don't manage and there's gaps in between, they will build up until the top of the screen. And if that happens, you lose the game. So you have to be very quick, and you have to like rotate them around so that they fall in the right place to form horizontal lines for them together.
Okay.
And it's a very simple game, and it's actually quite stressful sometimes if you play it. I'm sure you can find it online. It's quite fun and interesting for a while. But actually it gives you a sense of control, and also it distracts people from the dreadful situation that they're in. So actually it can be quite helpful, which is kind of counterintuitive, but on a physiological basis, it seems to work.
Okay, thanks. So giving them something to do in which they have a sense of control is helpful. Okay.
Yeah, sense of control is super important. It's also if you ask people who have been raped or held up at gunpoint, if they had a feeling that they had control over the situation, like beating the person and the person stopped, or if they managed to save themselves, they have a much lower risk of developing PTSD, even though they were in an existentially dreadful situation. But the feeling of control is really important. And once people feel helpless, that is actually a high predictor for developing stress disorders or even post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, And now there's something very interesting. There's a wonderful TED Talk that I would like to draw your attention to from Kelly McGonigal, and it's called How to Make Stress Your Friend. A bit counterintuitive, but actually she's absolutely right. And her conclusion, and the most important sentence in her presentation, is what makes us sick, and this is based on research, is not the stress itself, but our attitude towards stress and, very importantly, ourselves. So if I'm nice to myself, I don't blame myself, telling myself I'm incapable of doing this, I will never succeed, I will never manage. These are thoughts everybody has once in a while. But if I successfully overcome these thoughts and actually develop compassion with myself and be a good friend and supporter of myself, and then I manage to consider stress as a challenge rather than a burden, actually these people who manage to do that also have a much lower risk of developing any stress-related problems. So this is a very, very interesting result I found, and a TED Talk that I can only recommend. It's on YouTube. And under the address below, I'm gonna send the presentation to Eve, so you have the link. You don't have to type it. So that is very interesting. If we summarize, you might recognize the lady in the picture. What I want you to remember from this presentation, many causes of stress are actually preventable, especially in projects, through good and anticipatory project management and helping together. Stress is a physical reaction, yes, which in its extreme and chronic form makes us sick in many, many ways, but mainly if we are convinced that it is making us sick and if we are too hard on ourselves. That is very important to know. So our attitude towards ourselves and the stresses that we're experiencing influences, first of all, the way how we deal with stress, feeling overwhelmed, giving up, or being nice to ourselves and getting help. So that is very, very important. And pleasant company who is spreading a good mood and happiness and is a very good example, like Diana, for example, is also always very, very helpful. Relaxation techniques, I didn't talk that much about it. I will send you a handout which has a couple of ideas that you might try. Actually, they don't take much time and they make a huge and scientifically measurable difference, and they can be applied anywhere. I can just close my eyes for 5 minutes, take some deep breaths, and that already will help me calm down. Asking myself how I feel, what I need right now, maybe a sip of water, maybe just a break. This can actually already be very, very helpful to reduce my momentary stress level. So these are the main takeaway messages. And if you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. And thank you for your attention for now.
Thank you so much, Johanna. That was wonderful. I think we can all take something away from this. I know I learned a lot, and I really appreciate some of the reminders that were in here. So thank you very much. And again, you did a fantastic job. And everyone, Johanna gave an extended version of this talk in Atlanta and put us all to work and talking. And it was a great, really, really wonderful exercise. So thank you again for doing it for us. It's harder to do the exercises on the e version of it, but
it is. But I will share some links on the handout. There are some links how you can get actually instructions online if you wanna try it. Usually it doesn't work really well the first time you do it if you've never meditated or relaxed before in that way, but it's quite helpful. Oh, and I think I forgot to answer one question that you and Diana asked. What's next, right? What's happening after the scholarship? So that is a very good question. Actually, at the moment, well, technically I still have my job at the Children's Hospital. I'm just on study leave, but I think my boss is pretty well aware that I don't go abroad for 2 years to come back and do the same thing that I did before. So at the moment, my fiance and I are applying for jobs basically anywhere, and hope that we find a place where we can both apply our skills. He's also he's doing a Master's of International Development Policy at Duke University as a Fulbright scholar from Afghanistan. So we're trying to find a place where we can both be active and do what we're good at.
great. We wish you the best. I didn't mean to preempt any questions, everyone, so please feel free. We've got a few more minutes if you have questions for Johanna. And don't forget to unmute. I've got you all muted. So there we go. You're all unmuted. Anyone who wants it.
This is Jeanne. Thank you so much for your presentation. Can you give some examples of how people at the trip to Nicaragua, how people were resilient there with project stress?
Well, we actually had a situation where the people who were delivering material, and actually the people who should unlock the door to the construction site, they simply didn't show up. They were supposed to be there at 7. We all got up at 5 to get there. We were a bit tired and jet lagged, so they were not there. Well, we were very fortunate that the whole group was very good friends with each other. So there was a great amount of humor, of optimism, and just taking things not too seriously, in the sense of not getting aggravated about things that are happening, but being flexible. So that was actually a very positive example of how things could be done. We had one member who had never been to a non-Western country, and he saw that all the chairs in the school were broken. So he started taking them apart and fixing the ones that were still repairable with parts of the ones that were irreparable. And at some point he got stuck, and he got really devastated about the fact that actually he kind of broke a chair and he didn't have replacement parts to repair it. So he felt strongly that he had actually caused damage. He came all the way to help people, and now he was there and caused damage and took away some of the few chairs that they had left. So he was very aggravated about that. But we managed to convince him that, like, how about we go buy replacement parts, you know? There was a very good hardware store in a nearby city. So actually that's what we did. And they ended up with many more functional chairs than before. So actually, again, like, not losing your optimism and doing something about the situation and helping together is really the way to go. Yeah. Diana, do you have more examples from your?
I think on the whole, people were very able to accept the conditions there, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were all just very willing to take what was there and not wish the situation was different.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And not to be too ambitious. You cannot expect that things work out the same way as they would in the US. It's impossible.
Right.
So if you lower your expectations a little bit in terms of outcomes, focus more on relationship, on the bonds that are building with locals as well. That is actually in most cultures more important than how many players are being played in them.
Hi, this is Rich, Johanna. I've always found when I'm going into an unknown, stressful environment, that it's really not the conditions that matter as much as having people on the other side that are willing to work with me through all those conditions that I'm not familiar with. So when I come back to the United States after being away for a long time, I feel more like a fish out of water than I do when I go somewhere abroad that I've never been to before, mainly because there are people on the other side that are helping me. Whereas when we come back to the United States, nobody helps me whatsoever. And I have to relearn how to do a lot of things, like get a driver's license, when the car has to be registered and checked for exhaust and all the other stuff. So it's very frustrating because there's no welcome, there's no safety net to get into. Whereas overseas, if there are people on the other side that are willing to smile and help you, it just feels so much better.
Yeah. I totally agree with you, Richard. Thank you very much for that. I actually had the same experience when I came back from Lebanon. I was packed with bags. I had, of course, like tons of souvenirs and way too much baggage. I don't even know how I got that on the plane, retrospectively. And so I ended up at Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, Central Station, and I struggled getting out of the train. And nobody would help me. There was a lot of strong guys who could have easily have helped me. And they looked at me, laughed, and just walked away. And I was like, this is impossible. And the only guy who helped me was someone, I think he was from Iraq or Afghanistan. So, what you described in cultural science is two concepts that kick in. One is actually the difference between individualism and collectivism. You know, and that in an individualistic society, everybody is more responsible for themselves. So there's not as much help as there is in collectivist societies. And once you get the hang of collectivism, it's really hard to go back.
Yes.
Because it is indeed very, very pleasant. The other thing is the return culture shock that we have when we spend more time abroad. That you actually get culturalized with your host culture. And then you come back to your own culture and you have changed, but the home culture has not, or has changed in a different direction.
True.
So most people don't expect actually that. So the return culture shock can actually be worse than the first culture shock when going abroad, because that's kind of expect that it will be different. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Richard.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And that last point was one of the things I remember when we were talking with our daughter when she was getting ready to go abroad for her Rotary exchange year, and it came up over and over again that she might have a harder time coming back. So thank you. So, Johanna, this is just a little something we do. It's our virtual certificate of appreciation to express our thanks for your being here tonight. And we know we can't take it with us, but you can just picture it in your mind. And we're just really thankful for your talk tonight and for sharing, I think, incredibly valuable bits of wisdom as we all try to be a little more resilient in every aspect of our life. So thank you. So with that, we're going to close out this evening with the four-way test. And sorry, I'm confused here. And David, would you like to lead us in the four-way test this evening?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of the things we think, say, and do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial?
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And we'll I'm going to stop the official meeting, but please feel free to linger for a few minutes if you'd like to chat. Thank you.